The crash of fine-bone china against the polished black marble sounded like a firing squad. Vera, wearing a faded beige cleaning tunic, lay sprawled in a pool of gray mop water and jagged porcelain shards on the top floor of the Shin Tech Tower. Her knees were scraped, and her hands were raw, but her fingers remained clamped tightly around a thin silver chain hidden beneath her collar. Above her stood Shin Teo, the golden boy of Seoul's tech scene, his hand-stitched Italian loafers inches from her face, and a look of pure, manic disgust in his eyes. "I hired a maid, not a walking disaster," he sneered, casually kicking a fallen bucket, sending a fresh wave of dirty water over her trembling shoulders. "You're as useless as the dirt you're supposed to be cleaning." What Teo didn't know, what the terrified interns watching from the glass-walled offices couldn't see, was that the pendant on Vera's chain had just pulsed to silent, biometric code black. It was a signal that skipped the police and went straight to the encrypted phone of Baek Minjun, the dragon of the Iron Lotus Syndicate. And he was currently in a black sedan, turning into the building's private parking garage exactly 60 seconds away. The Shin Tech penthouse is a monument to the ego of the 1%. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlook the Han River, and the air smells of expensive espresso and cold ambition. It is a place where efficiency is a religion and people are treated like software. Either they work or they are deleted. And right now, in the center of this pristine glass temple, the glitch was Vera. She lay gasping, the cold mop water soaking into her modest uniform, her dark hair plastered to her forehead. She looked small. She looked breakable. The staff stood paralyzed. No one stepped forward with a towel. No one offered a hand. This is the first psychological truth of the corporate world. Institutional cowardice. Teo played to his disciples. He paced around her like a wolf circling a wounded lamb, adjusting his gold dragon pendant, a symbol of power he thought he had earned. He wasn't just firing her, he was performing an act of dominance for his empire. "Look at you," he spat, his voice echoing off the 20-foot ceilings. "I gave you a chance to breathe the same air as greatness, and you couldn't even manage a mop. You're nothing but a lazy, invisible ghost. Now, get out of my sight before I have security drag you to the curb where you belong." Vera didn't answer. She simply closed her eyes, feeling the vibration of the building's heavy freight elevators beginning their rapid, non-stop ascent to the top floor. The dragon had arrived. The silence that followed Teo's shout was heavier than the air in the room. It was the kind of quiet that happens right before a giant tree falls in a forest. Vera remained on the floor, her fingers still curled around the silver pendant. She didn't look up at the man towering over her. She didn't need to. She could feel his anger radiating off him like heat from a stove. Teo turned his back on her, reaching for the sleek intercom on his mahogany desk. He wanted to call security to finish the job of throwing her out. But when his finger pressed the button, nothing happened. The glowing blue light that usually signaled his power was dead. He frowned, clicking it again, harder this time. Still, the machine remained cold and dark. "What is wrong with this thing?" he muttered. He reached for his smartphone, but the screen stayed black. No matter how many times he tapped it, the device refused to wake up. Then, the world changed. A deep, low hum vibrated through the floor tiles, traveling up through Vera's body and into Teo's expensive shoes. It sounded like a massive beast waking up in the basement. Suddenly, the bright, overhead lights flickered once, twice, and then went out completely. The giant office was plunged into a strange, gray twilight. Only the dim afternoon sun peeking through the clouds offered any light. Across the room, the massive glass doors that led to the hallway slid shut with a heavy thud. The electronic locks clicked into place with a sound as final as a prison cell door closing. Teo rushed to the entrance, pulling at the handles, but they wouldn't budge. He looked out through the glass at his employees in the main office. They were all standing up, looking at their own dead computers and dark phones with confused faces. "Open the door," Teo yelled, banging his fist against the glass. "Someone call maintenance. The system is crashing." But no one could hear him. The soundproof glass that he had installed to keep out the noise of the common workers now kept his voice trapped inside. Even worse, the heavy steel security shutters, the ones meant to protect the building during a riot, began to slide down over the windows. One by one, the view of the Han River and the city of Seoul disappeared, replaced by cold, hard metal. Within seconds, the penthouse was cut off from the rest of the world. No internet, no phone service, no way out. Teo spun around, his breathing coming in fast, shallow gasps. The room was now so dark that he could barely see the edges of his own desk. The only thing he could clearly see was the white shape of Vera's cleaning uniform on the floor. She hadn't moved. She hadn't screamed. She was just sitting there in the middle of the spilled water, as calm as a statue. "Did you do this?" Teo hissed, his voice trembling. He knew it was impossible. How could a maid who spent her days scrubbing toilets break into the most advanced security system in the country? But the way she was sitting there, not bothered by the darkness or the locks, made his skin crawl. "Answer me. What did you do to my building?" Vera finally looked up. In the shadows, her eyes didn't look like the eyes of a tired servant anymore. They were sharp and steady. She stood up slowly, ignoring the pain in her scraped knees. She didn't look like trash anymore. She looked like someone who was waiting for a guest to arrive. "I didn't do anything, Mr. Shin," she said softly. Her voice was steady, unlike his. "But I think you should sit down. The air in here is going to get very thin very soon." Teo felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. He backed away from her, stumbling over his own designer chair. He was the boss. He was the king of this tower. But as he looked at the locked doors and the dark screens, he realized he wasn't in charge anymore. He was trapped in a high-tech cage, and the woman he had just kicked was the only other person with a key. Outside in the hallway, the red emergency lights began to pulse. They cast long, bloody shadows into the office. Teo watched the shadow of the maid grow long and tall against the wall, stretching until she looked like a giant. He tried to speak, to order her to stay away, but his throat felt like it was full of sand. He had spent his whole life looking down at people like Vera. He thought they were invisible. He thought they didn't matter. But now, in the dark, she was the only thing he could see. And for the first time in his life, the powerful CEO was truly afraid of the dark. While Teo trapped himself in his own fear upstairs, the ground floor of the Shin Tech Tower was experiencing a different kind of silence. The glass revolving doors, which usually spun with the constant movement of busy interns and wealthy investors, had ground to a sudden halt. The bright lobby, usually filled with the hum of high-speed internet and quiet chatter, felt like a tomb. Then the sound started. It was a heavy, rhythmic thud. It wasn't the sound of office shoes or the light tapping of sneakers. It was the sound of thick, leather boots striking the expensive marble floor with the weight of a tank. A fleet of 12 black SUVs had pulled onto the sidewalk, blocking every lane of traffic. From the vehicles stepped men who didn't look like they belonged in a tech office. They didn't carry laptops or tablets. Instead, they moved with a military precision that made the street outside go quiet. At the center of them was Baek Min-jun. Min-jun didn't look angry. He looked like a man who had already won a war and was just arriving to collect the prize. His black suit was perfectly pressed, but his shirt was open at the collar, showing the dark ink of a dragon's tail that curled up his neck. His face was a mask of cold stone. He didn't need to shout to get attention. His presence was like a heavy weight that pushed the air out of the room. The lobby security guards, men who were paid to look tough in their blue uniforms, took one look at the group and began to back away. They recognized the symbol on the small silver pins the visitors wore, the Iron Lotus. It was a name whispered in the dark corners of the city, a name that meant power beyond the reach of the law. One guard reached for his belt, but he stopped when he heard a series of metallic clicks. Click, click, click. It was the sound of dozens of weapons being readied. There was no yelling, no dramatic threats. Just the cold, mechanical sound of metal meeting metal. The message was clear. Anyone who moved would be erased. The guards raised their hands slowly, their faces turning pale. They stepped aside, opening a path that led straight to the private executive elevators. Min-jun didn't even look at them. His eyes were fixed on the digital floor indicator above the elevator doors. He pulled a black glove onto his right hand, his movements slow and careful. He wasn't in a hurry. He knew that the building was locked down. He knew that Teo was trapped. Most importantly, he knew his wife was hurting. Floor 77, Min-jun said. His voice was soft, like silk being pulled over a blade, but it carried to every corner of the silent lobby. One of his men, a giant of a man with a scarred cheek, stepped forward and swiped a special black card across the elevator sensor. The system, which had been frozen solid just moments ago, suddenly beeped and turned green. The door slid open with a polite chime that felt strangely out of place in the middle of a Mafia invasion. Min-jun stepped inside the elevator. He turned around to face the lobby as the doors began to close. For a brief second, the people watching saw a flicker of something in his eyes. It wasn't just the coldness of a boss. It was the terrifying rage of a husband who had found out someone had touched his world. The elevator began its climb. There were no stops. There were no interruptions. Inside the small metal box, the only sound was the clicking of the floor numbers changing. 70, 71, 72. Down in the lobby, the people remained frozen. They watched the red numbers climb higher and higher. They knew that when those doors opened on the top floor, the world of Shin Teo was going to come crashing down. The dragon was no longer at the gates. He was already inside the house. The elevator doors at the top of the Shin Tech Tower opened with a soft bell sound that cut through the dark office like a knife. Teo jumped at the noise, his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked toward the hallway, expecting to see a security guard or a maintenance worker. Instead, a wall of shadows stepped out of the metal box. Leading them was a man who moved with a calm that was scarier than any shout. Baek Min-jun walked into the penthouse office, as if he owned the molecules in the air. Behind him, four large men in black suits fanned out, their eyes scanning the room with cold, machine-like focus. They didn't look at the expensive art or the high-tech gadgets. They only looked for threats. Teo stood frozen behind his desk. "Who are you?" he managed to choke out, his voice cracking. "This is a private office. You can't be here." Min-jun didn't answer. He didn't even look at Teo. His eyes were fixed on the floor, in the center of the room. He saw the spilled gray water. He saw the sharp, white pieces of broken porcelain. And then he saw Vera. She was still standing there, her beige uniform soaked and dirty. When she saw him, her shoulders dropped just a little bit, as if a heavy weight had been lifted. Min-jun walked toward her, his heavy boots crunching on the broken shards of the vase Teo had broken. He stopped just inches from her, his shadow completely covering her small frame. The room felt like it had lost all its heat. Min-jun reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a white silk handkerchief. It was perfectly clean and folded. Slowly, gently, he reached out. His large hand, which looked like it could crush a stone, was incredibly soft as he tilted Vera's chin up. He began to wipe the dirty mop water from her forehead. He moved with a tenderness that made the interns watching through the glass walls gasp. He wiped the wet hair away from her eyes and cleaned a smudge of dirt from her cheek. He acted like she was the most precious thing in the world, and the dirt on her was a crime against the universe. "Jagiya," Min-jun whispered. His voice was low, but in the silent office, it sounded like thunder. "Are you hurt?" Vera shook her head slowly.
"I'm okay, Min-jun."
"Just a little cold." Min-jun's jaw tightened. He folded the soiled handkerchief and tucked it away. Finally, he turned his head to look at Teo. The CEO felt like he had been locked in a freezer with a hungry wolf. Min-jun didn't look like a businessman anymore. He looked like the dragon he was named after. "You," Min-jun said. The word was short and sharp. Teo tried to find his courage. He clutched the edge of his mahogany desk until his knuckles turned white. "Listen, I don't know who you think you are, but that woman is just a lazy maid. She broke a very expensive." Min-jun took one step forward. It wasn't a fast move, but Teo flinched as if he had been struck. The Mafia boss pointed a gloved finger at the wet floor where Vera had been lying. "I have a very simple question for you," Min-jun said, his eyes narrowing into cold slits. "The report I received said there was a struggle. My wife doesn't fall easily. So, I want to hear it from your mouth, before I decide what happens to this building. Minjun stepped closer, the light from the red emergency pulses making the dragon tattoo on his neck look like it was moving. Who touched my wife?
Minjun asked.
Who thought it was a good idea to raise a foot against the woman I promised to protect? Teo looked at the massive men standing by the door. He looked at the weapons hidden under their jackets. He looked back at Minjun's face and realized that all his money and all his tech couldn't save him now. The silence in the room was so loud it felt like it was screaming. Teo's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He had spent the afternoon acting like a giant, but in front of the Iron Lotus, he had never felt smaller. The red pulsing lights of the office seemed to fade away, replaced by the memory of a much darker night 3 years ago. Back then, Vera wasn't wearing a maid's uniform, and Minjun wasn't standing in a penthouse. They were in a cold, rain-soaked alleyway in the heart of the city. The air had smelled of wet pavement and old iron. That night, a terrible gang war had broken out. It was a fight for control that had left the streets covered in broken glass and spent shell casings. Vera had been caught in the middle of it. She wasn't a fighter. She was just a young woman who had seen too much. She had watched as families fled and homes were destroyed by the greed of men seeking power. When the smoke finally cleared, she had made a choice that shocked everyone who knew her. She had knelt in the dirt and made a vow of silence. She promised herself that she would never again be part of the noise and the violence. She wanted to disappear into the background. She wanted to do the humblest work possible, cleaning up the messes of the world, as a way to find peace. She chose to be a maid because in that role, people looked right through her. To the wealthy and the powerful, she became invisible, and in that invisibility, she felt safe from the storms of the underworld. Minjun had found her that night, leaning against a brick wall, her hands trembling. He was already a rising leader in the Iron Lotus, a man whose name made others whisper in fear. But when he looked at Vera, his hard eyes had softened. He saw a woman who was tired of the screaming and the blood. He saw someone who wanted to heal, not hurt. He had knelt before her, just as he was doing now in the office, and took her cold hands in his. He didn't ask her to join his world. He didn't ask her to pick up a weapon. Instead, he made a promise that became the foundation of their secret marriage. If you want to be silent, I will be your voice, he had whispered into the rainy night. If you want to be invisible, I will be the shadow that hides you. But I swear on my life, Vera, I will never let you bleed again. The world has taken enough from you. From this day on, anyone who tries to hurt you will have to answer to the dragon. Vera had looked into his eyes and saw a truth that went deeper than any gang oath. She saw a man who would burn the whole city down just to keep her safe. She had married him in secret, living 2 lives. By day, she scrubbed floors and emptied trash cans, finding a strange kind of quiet joy in the hard work. By night, she returned to the arms of the most dangerous man in Seoul, the only person who truly knew her name. Now, standing in the darkened penthouse, that memory felt more real than the cold mop water on her skin. She looked at Minjun's back as he faced the CEO. She saw the way his shoulders were set, like a mountain that could not be moved. He was remembering that rainy alleyway, too. He was remembering the vow he had made to a girl in the dirt. Teo didn't understand the history he had stepped into. He didn't know that by kicking the lazy maid, he had broken a peace treaty that had lasted for years. He had drawn blood from a woman who had sworn off violence, and in doing so, he had invited a monster back into the light. Minjun's promise wasn't just words, it was a debt of blood. And as the Mafia boss turned his cold gaze back to the trembling CEO, it was clear that the time had come to pay that debt in full. The red lights in the office continued to pulse like a slow heartbeat. Teo stood behind his desk, his hands shaking so much that he had to grip the wood to stay upright. He watched as the elevator doors opened once more. This time, it wasn't men with weapons who stepped out. It was 3 men in sharp, gray suits carrying slim silver laptops. They didn't look like soldiers, but the way they moved was just as scary. They were Minjun's lawyers, the men who fought wars with numbers and laws instead of bullets. Without saying a word, the lawyers walked over to the long conference table. They sat down and opened their laptops. The blue light from the screens cast a ghostly glow on their faces. Minjun didn't move from Vera's side. He kept his hand on her shoulder, a silent promise that he was still there. "Mr. Shin," one of the lawyers said, his voice as cold as a winter morning. "We have been looking into your company for a long time. It seems you have made many mistakes. You have taken money that wasn't yours. You have lied to your partners. And today, you decided to put your hands on the woman who actually owns the ground you stand on." Teoa's eyes went wide. "What are you talking about? I built this. This is my company." The lawyer didn't look up from his screen. His fingers flew across the keyboard. "Not anymore. Look at the wall." Suddenly, the large television screen behind Teoa's desk flickered to life. It showed the stock market in real time. The name Shin Tech was at the top of the list. Next to it was a long line of green numbers. But as they watched, the green turned to a bright, angry red. "The Iron Lotus holds 40% of your debt," Minjun said, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "And my wife holds the rest through her private accounts. We have decided that you are no longer a good investment." Teo watched in horror as the numbers began to tumble. It was like watching a mountain crumble into the sea. 10%, 20%. Every time a lawyer hit a key, millions of dollars disappeared into thin air. Teo's phone, which had been dead, suddenly started buzzing with hundreds of messages. His investors were panicking. His partners were bailing out. "Stop it!" Teo screamed, rushing toward the table. One of Minjun's guards stepped in front of him, his face a wall of stone. Teo stopped in his tracks, realizing he was powerless. "You're destroying everything. My life's work. You destroyed it the moment you thought you were better than the people who serve you," Minjun replied. He looked down at Vera, who was watching the screen with a sad, quiet look in her eyes. She didn't look happy to see the destruction. She just looked like she was watching a storm pass by. The numbers on the screen kept falling. The red line went straight down. In the business world, this was an execution. There was no blood on the floor, but everyone in the room knew that Shin Teo was being erased. His bank accounts were being frozen. His property was being seized. His name, which used to mean power, was becoming a warning to others. "It is finished," the lead lawyer said, closing his laptop with a soft click. "Mr. Shin, you no longer own a single share of this company. You are officially bankrupt. You own nothing but the suit you are wearing." Teo sank into his expensive leather chair. He looked around his beautiful office, but it didn't feel like his anymore. The glass walls felt like they were closing in. He looked at Vera, the lazy maid he had kicked just an hour ago. She was still standing tall, her face calm and her dignity unbroken. He had tried to humiliate her, but in the end, he was the one left with nothing. The silence in the penthouse was absolute, broken only by the sound of the wind whipping against the steel shutters outside. The king had been removed from his throne, and the dragon hadn't even had to raise a hand. The red lights continued to pulse, casting a rhythmic glow over the office. Teo sat in his chair, his eyes fixed on the floor. He was a man who had lost everything in the blink of an eye, but his mind was still trying to find a way out. He looked up at Minjun, who remained standing next to Vera like a protective wall of shadow. As Minjun leaned forward to whisper something to his wife, the heavy gold chain around his neck slid out from under his shirt. It caught the flickering light of the emergency lamps. Teo squinted, his eyes focusing on the heavy pendant dangling at the end of the links. It was a golden dragon, its body twisted into the shape of a blooming lotus flower. Teo's breath hitched in his throat. He felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead. That shape, that specific, intricate design. He had seen it before. It wasn't just a piece of jewelry worn by a mob boss. It was a symbol he had stared at for hours during the early days of his career. He scrambled toward his desk, his hands fumbling with the bottom drawer. He pulled out a thick, leather-bound folder. These were his founding documents, the original papers that had allowed him to start Shin Tech 5 years ago. He flipped through the pages until he reached the very last one, where the signature of his silent partner was located. There, stamped in deep red ink at the bottom of the page, was the exact same insignia, the dragon and the lotus. Teo looked from the paper to the gold chain around Minjun's neck, and then finally, his gaze landed on Vera. The realization hit him like a physical blow to the chest. When he had started his company, he was broke. A mysterious investment group had reached out to him, offering millions of dollars in exchange for a majority share of the business. He had never met the owners. He had only dealt with lawyers in gray suits. He had assumed it was just a group of wealthy businessmen who liked his ideas. "The Iron Lotus," Teo whispered, his voice trembling with a new kind of terror. "The seed money, the venture capital, it didn't come from a bank." Minjun stepped closer to the desk, the gold dragon swinging slowly. "You are a talented boy with a good plan, Teo. My wife saw your potential. She told me that even in a world of machines, there should be room for dreams. She was the one who convinced me to sign those papers." Teo looked at Vera, his mouth hanging open. The woman he had called lazy and invisible was the reason he had a throne to sit on in the first place. Every brick in this building, every computer in the office, and every dollar he had ever spent had come from her kindness and her husband's power. "You didn't just kick a maid," Minjun said, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. "You kicked your boss. You kicked the person who fed you when you were hungry and gave you a name when you were a nobody. You wore our symbol on your contracts while you spit on our faces." Teo looked down at the documents in his hands. The red ink of the Iron Lotus seal looked like a fresh wound. He realized now why the lawyers had been able to destroy him so quickly. They weren't just attacking a stranger. They were simply taking back what had always belonged to them. He looked at the gold chain again. It wasn't just a sign of wealth. It was a leash. And he had been the one to pull on it until the dragon decided to bite. The office felt smaller than ever, and the heavy metal shutters on the windows seemed to echo the finality of his mistake. He had built his entire life on a foundation he didn't understand. And now, the owner of that foundation was standing right in front of him, demanding payment for the disrespect. The office was so quiet that Teo could hear the sweat dripping off his chin and hitting the leather folder. He looked up from the Iron Lotus seal, his eyes red and full of tears. The red emergency lights kept flashing, making the room look like it was underwater. Minjun stood perfectly still, but his shadows seemed to fill every corner of the penthouse. I didn't know," Teo whispered, his voice shaking. "I thought the money was just from an investment group. I never meant to disrespect." "You didn't need to know who I was to show respect to a human being," Minjun interrupted. His voice was not loud, but it cut through Teo's excuses like a sharp blade. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a single sheet of paper. He laid it on the mahogany desk right over the old founding documents. Teo looked down. It was a transfer of ownership. It was a simple paper that said Shin Teo was giving up everything, his title, his office, his cars, and his name, to the Iron Lotus Syndicate. "The math is very simple, Mr. Shin," Minjun said, leaning over the desk until his face was only inches from Teo's. "You have stolen from us. You have lied to us. And most importantly, you have hurt my wife. In my world, that is a debt that can only be paid in two ways." Minjun held up two fingers, his black glove appearing dark and predatory in the red light. "Option 1, Minjun began. "You sign that paper right now. You walk out of this building with nothing but the clothes on your back. My men will take you to the airport, and you will leave Korea forever. You will never speak our names. You will never return. You will be a ghost, but you will be a living ghost." Teo swallowed hard. He looked at the heavy steel shutters on the windows. He felt like he was already in a coffin. And the other way? Minjun's smile didn't reach his eyes. It was a cold, sharp expression that made the hair on Teo's neck stand up. "Option 2 is the traditional way. My men call it balancing the books.
We don't use lawyers for that.
We use the basement. We use the cold harbor water. We make sure that anyone who dares to kick a dragon feels exactly what it's like to have the world kick back." Behind Minjun, the four large men in black suits moved slightly. The sound of their heavy boots and the creak of their leather jackets filled the room. One of them cracked his knuckles. It was a small sound, but in the silent office, it sounded like a bone breaking. Teo looked at Vera. She was still standing there, her face calm and her eyes distant. She wasn't looking at him with hate. She was looking at him with pity, which felt even worse. She was the one who had given him everything, and he had thrown it away because he thought he was too big to be kind. "You have 10 seconds, Minjun said. He wasn't looking at a watch. He was just staring into Teoa's soul.
10, 9, 8.
Teoa's hand reached for the expensive gold pen on his desk. His fingers were trembling so much he almost dropped it. He looked at the paper, then at the dark hallway where the men were waiting, and then back at the paper. He realized that his life as a CEO was over. The lights, the fame, the power, it was all gone.
7,
6. Teo slammed the pen onto the paper. He scribbled his name as fast as he could, the ink smearing across the page. He pushed the paper toward Minjun and collapsed back into his chair, sobbing into his hands. Minjun picked up the paper and looked at it carefully. He nodded once to his lawyers, who closed their laptops. The dragon finally stepped back, his hand returning to Vera's shoulder. He didn't say, "Thank you." He didn't say goodbye. He simply looked at the guard by the door and made a small motion with his head. "Take him to the airport," Minjun ordered. "Make sure he gets on the plane. And make sure he understands that if he ever touches Korean soil again, there won't be a choice next time." The guards moved forward, grabbing Teo by the arms and dragging him out of his leather chair. The CEO didn't fight. He didn't scream. He just hung his head as they led him toward the elevator. The doors opened with a chime, and the man who had started the day as a king was taken away like a criminal. The penthouse was finally quiet, leaving only the husband, the wife, and the truth that remained in the shadows. The elevator doors closed with a final metallic ring, taking the broken CEO away from the empire he had built on a lie. The penthouse was finally still. The red emergency lights stopped flashing, and the overhead lamps flickered back to a steady, warm glow as the building's computer system recognized its true owner. Minjun stepped back, giving Vera the space she needed to breathe. For a moment, she looked down at her wet, beige sleeves and the dirty water still dripping from her hem. Without saying a word, she walked toward the private executive lounge behind the desk. Minjun's men stood like statues, their backs to her to give her privacy. A few minutes later, the door opened and the lazy maid was gone. In her place stood a woman the office staff had never truly seen. Vera had changed into a sharp, charcoal gray suit that fit her perfectly. She had washed the mop water from her hair, pulling it back into a tight, elegant bun that showed the calm strength in her face. She wore no jewelry except for the thick silver wedding ring that she had moved from the hidden chain to her finger. She stepped out onto the marble floor, her expensive heels clicking with a rhythm that sounded like a drumbeat of power. Teo was already gone, but his presence still hung in the air like a bad smell. Vera walked to the center of the room and stopped. She didn't look tired or small anymore. She looked like the person who had been holding the strings of a city all along. "Director Han," she said. Her voice was the biggest shock of all. It wasn't the quiet, shaky whisper of a servant. It was a voice of pure command, deep, steady, and sharp enough to cut glass. It was the kind of voice that people followed into battle without asking why. One of the lawyers, a man who had ignored her all afternoon, immediately stood up and bowed so low his forehead nearly touched the table. "Yes, madam." "Clear the floor," Vera ordered, her eyes scanning the glass walls where the interns were still staring in shock. "Tell the staff that Shintech is under new management. No one is losing their job today, but the rules are changing. From this moment on, every person in this building will be treated with respect, or they will be escorted out by my husband's men. Is that understood?" "Perfectly, madam," the lawyer replied, his voice trembling slightly. He had seen her clean his shoes just last week, and the memory made him break out in a cold sweat. Vera turned toward the giant windows. She pressed a button on the desk, and the heavy steel shutters began to rise. The orange light of the setting sun flooded the room, turning the office into a sea of gold. She looked out at the Han River, the water glowing like fire. "Minjun," she said, her voice softening just a little as she looked at her husband. "I am here, Vera," he replied, stepping up behind her. He didn't try to take charge. He stood a half step behind her, showing everyone in the room that while he was the dragon of the underworld, she was the one he followed. Teo thought I was invisible because I chose to be, Vera said, her reflection in the glass looking back at her with hard, bright eyes. He thought my silence was weakness. He forgot that the most dangerous part of a storm is the eye, where everything is quiet. She turned away from the window and walked toward the CEO's large leather chair. She didn't sit in it. Instead, she put her hand on the back of the chair and pushed it aside, as if it were nothing more than a piece of junk. She looked at the office, the screens, and the men waiting for her next move. The transformation was complete. The maid was dead, and the secret empress of the Iron Lotus had finally taken her throne. The air in the penthouse felt fresh and clear for the first time in 5 years, and the silence that followed was no longer a vow. It was a warning. The heavy glass doors of the Shin Tech Tower hissed open for the last time that day. Shin Teo did not walk out. He was half-carried and half-dragged by 2 of Minjun's men. They reached the edge of the sidewalk and let go. Teo stumbled, his expensive leather shoes slipping on the wet concrete until he fell to his knees. His tailored suit, once a symbol of his pride, was now wrinkled and stained with the dirty mop water from the office floor. He looked up at the towering skyscraper that used to have his name on the front. In the fading light of the sunset, the building looked like a giant tombstone. He reached into his pockets, but they were empty. No phone, no wallet, and no keys to the silver sports car that was already being towed away by a black truck. He was a king who had been stripped of his crown, standing in the middle of a city that didn't even recognize his face anymore. People walked past him, busy with their own lives, not sparing a single glance for the man who had just lost an empire. A long, charcoal black limousine pulled up to the curb, its engine purring like a quiet beast. The door was opened by a man in a dark suit who bowed so low his head was level with the car's roof. Minjun stepped out first, his hand resting on the door to keep it steady. He didn't look at Teo. To the dragon, the man on the sidewalk was already a ghost. Then, Vera stepped out. She was no longer the girl in the beige uniform. She stood tall in her gray suit, her eyes reflecting the glowing lights of the city. She stopped for a moment, looking down at the man who had kicked her just hours before. Teo looked up at her, his mouth opening as if to beg for one last chance, but no words came out. He saw the silver ring on her finger, and he finally understood that the lazy maid had never been the one who needed saving. "The street is a cold place for someone who doesn't know how to walk on it, Mr. Shin," Vera said. Her voice was calm, but it carried a weight that made Teo flinch. "I spent years down here learning how to be humble. Maybe now you will finally learn how to be human." She didn't wait for an answer. She turned away and stepped into the back of the limousine. Minjun followed her, sliding onto the leather seat beside her and closing the door with a soft, heavy thud that blocked out the noise of the street. The tinted windows were like a wall of midnight, hiding them from the world. Inside the car, the air was warm and smelled of expensive cedar and peace. Minjun took Vera's hand in his thumb tracing the circle of her wedding ring. "Are you ready to go home, Madam Beck?" he asked softly. Vera leaned her head against his shoulder and looked out at the blurred lights of Seoul as the car began to move. She felt the weight of the company she now owned and the power of the family she had tried to hide from. The penance was over. She had tried to be invisible, but the world had forced her to show her strength. "Yes," Vera replied, her voice steady and sure. "Take me home. I'm finished with cleaning up other people's messes. It's time to start building something of our own." The limousine sped away, disappearing into the sea of red taillights and city shadows. On the sidewalk, Shin Teo remained on his knees, a broken man in a high-tech world, finally realizing that the person he had called nothing was actually everything. The maid had reclaimed her throne, and the dragon was finally at rest.